The rain came down slowly at first, then all at once, the way a man's whole life can change between one breath and the next. It was a Tuesday in November, and the city of Chicago had turned the color of ash. The kind of morning where the sky pressed down heavy on your shoulders, like it already knew what was coming. Like it had been holding something back all week and could no longer carry the weight of it alone. There were over 400 people gathered at the cemetery. 400, every single one of them had come because they were afraid not to. These were politicians, judges. Men who ran warehouses along the river, men who moved money through restaurant books and real estate ledgers, men who had made careers out of appearing untouchable. Men who had shaken the hand of the deceased's husband and smiled the particular smile of people who want you to believe they are not afraid of you. They had all come to bury Elena Morty. But they had also come to watch her husband, because in 31 years not one person in that city had ever seen Vincent Morty cry, not when rivals threatened his territory. Not when men he trusted turned their backs, not when his own father passed without a final word between them, not once. In 3 decades of building the most feared criminal organization in northern Illinois, Vincent Morty had worn his face like a stone wall, composed, still, and utterly without mercy toward any feeling that might make him appear human. People who worked for him called it a gift, people who feared him called it something darker than that. But that Tuesday morning, as Elena's white casket was slowly lowered into the earth, something in Vincent Morty broke open that no one had ever seen before, and no one would ever fully understand until 3 days later. When his daughter found a small leather journal hidden at the bottom of a cedar chest in the bedroom. He didn't simply shed tears, he collapsed, not forward into the arms of those standing nearby, not backward toward the grave. He went sideways, like something inside him had been holding him upright for years and suddenly quit without warning. He dropped to one knee in the wet November grass, one hand pressed flat against the cold ground, and he made a sound that the people standing closest to him would spend years trying to describe. Some said it was like watching a building fall in slow motion. Some said it was the most human sound they had ever heard from any person. One man, a federal prosecutor who had spent 11 years building a case against Vincent Morty and had come to the cemetery that morning feeling something close to triumph, turned away from the grave and walked back to his car without looking back. He told his wife that evening that he didn't feel victorious anymore. He said he felt like he had witnessed something private that he had no right to see. Nobody moved to comfort Vincent Morty. Nobody in that cemetery knew how. What none of them understood, what none of them could have possibly known, was the secret buried inside that cedar chest. The 30 years of silence his wife had kept, the sacrifice she had made for him without his knowledge. The truth that would not surface until after the funeral, when his daughter sat across from him in the living room with a small leather journal in her trembling hands and said, quietly, "Dad, there's something you need to know about who Mom really was." That revelation would shatter him more completely than anything that had shattered him before. But first you need to understand who Elena was. You need to understand where this love began and why it mattered more than anything Vincent Morty ever built or destroyed in his entire life. Elena Russo was 22 years old the first time she walked through the kitchen of the restaurant where her cousin worked as manager and found a man sitting alone at a back table, eating soup. He wasn't dressed the way she expected powerful men to dress. No gold watch, no expensive suit, at least not that evening. He wore a dark gray sweater and reading glasses pushed halfway down his nose, and he had a small notebook open beside his bowl. He was writing something slowly, like each word required real thought before it could be committed to the page. She almost walked past him. She almost walked all the way past him and into the back storage room to retrieve the parsley her cousin had sent her for, but something made her pause, something in the way he sat. There was a stillness about him that felt unusual for a man his size, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with hands that looked like they had done hard work once, even if they no longer did. She stood in the doorway and looked at him for only a moment. He looked up from his notebook. And in the half-second before he composed himself, before whatever armor he usually wore settled back into place, Elena Russo saw something in his expression that she recognized immediately. Loneliness, not the kind that comes from being physically alone, the other kind. The kind that lives inside a person when they are surrounded by people who want something from them, and none of those people want the thing that actually matters. She said, "Is the soup too cold?" You've stopped eating it, he blinked, then almost against his will he smiled. The soup is fine, I was thinking. About what? Something I read this morning, a quote. I can't decide if it's true. She leaned against the doorframe. What did it say? He turned the notebook toward her. She walked closer to read it, closer than she strictly needed to be, and looked at the words on the page. A man who does not know how to love cannot know how to lead. She stood there a moment. Then she said, I think it's true. You don't even know who wrote it. Doesn't matter who wrote it. She looked directly at him. It's still true. She went to get the parsley. He stayed for 2 more hours. He came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, each time sitting at the same back table. Each time ordering soup, though her cousin told her privately that Vincent Morty had never once ordered soup in his life before that autumn. He came back because of her. She understood this before he said it, the way certain people understand certain things about certain others before any words are exchanged. She understood it and she was not frightened by it. She was, if anything, careful, because Alina Russo had grown up in a neighborhood where she understood perfectly well what certain surnames meant, what certain men did for their money. What kind of world operated in the spaces between the visible world, in the back offices of car dealerships and the private rooms of social clubs. She knew who Vincent Morty was from the very first moment, and she walked back out of that kitchen with the parsley anyway. Later in her life, her daughter would ask her why. Why she had not turned away, why she had not simply chosen a safer path, a quieter life, a man who came home at a reasonable hour carrying nothing more dangerous than an unpaid parking ticket. Alina's answer, which she recorded in her journal years later, was simple, because I saw inside him before he could hide it. And what I saw was worth reaching for. They were married in the spring of 1989, a small church ceremony because Alina wanted it that way, 30 guests. Her mother in the front row with a handkerchief pressed to her mouth, Vincent's older brother standing beside him as best man, no speeches, no orchestra, no display designed to impress anyone. Just the vows, the candles, and the way Vincent's voice, which had never once trembled in any room he had ever entered, trembled when he said her name. The priest noticed. He wrote about it in his own diary that evening. He wrote, I have married many men to many women. I have never seen a groom appear so afraid of the goodness of what stood before him. The early years were full of small, quiet happinesses. Alina made their home on the north side into something warm, not grand, not decorated to impress, but warm in the specific way that only someone who understands comfort can create it. She put bookshelves in the hallway. She grew tomatoes in the backyard every summer, starting the seedlings on the kitchen windowsill in February. Talking to them in a low voice that she claimed made them grow faster, and which Vincent claimed was the strangest thing he had ever witnessed. He watched her from the kitchen table one Sunday morning in March, the seedlings lined up in their small cups on the windowsill, Alina speaking quietly to each one as she watered it. He watched her for a long time before she noticed. When she turned and found him looking, she said, Don't say a word, he said. I wasn't going to say anything. You were smiling. I wasn't. She gave him a look that meant she knew perfectly well he had been. He looked away, but she had already seen it, the thing his face did when he forgot to be careful, the thing he only allowed himself around her. She gave him 2 children in those years. A daughter, Katerina, in 1991, a son, Marco, in 1994. Vincent loved those children with a fierceness that surprised even him. There are things a father feels when he holds his daughter for the first time that no amount of power or money can prepare him for. There are moments of absolute tenderness that break through every barrier a man spends years constructing around himself, but Alina saw it differently than anyone else did. She saw it as proof that she had been right about him, that the man in the gray sweater writing in his notebook was real. That the other man, the one who made judges clear their calendars and made lieutenants lower their voices, that man was not the whole truth of him. She held on to that belief for many years. Even when it became difficult, even when holding it began to cost her something, by the mid-1990s, Vincent Morty's name had weight that could not be spoken about in public. Federal investigators had thick folders with his name on the tab. 3 of the most powerful men in the Chicago underworld had tried to negotiate with him, and all 3 had eventually stepped back and given him room he had not even asked for. His reputation was built not on spectacle but on consistency. He was a man who said exactly what he meant and meant exactly what he said. In another life, that quality might have made him a formidable politician or a remarkable businessman. In the life he had chosen, it made him the most trusted and most feared figure in a world that did not trust easily. All of that power required constant attention. It required dinners that ended very late, phone calls that could not be explained, men arriving at the house at unexpected hours, trips that lasted longer than promised. And Alina Morty, who was raising 2 children, running a household, and holding the private center of a man who could not afford to be private anywhere else, began to feel the weight of that life settling into her bones like weather. She never complained publicly, that is important to understand. She never called her mother to cry about her marriage. She was not a woman who aired private pain in public spaces. But in a small leather journal she had started keeping in 1996, she wrote about it with complete honesty. He is becoming someone else's, not another woman's, something worse than that. He is becoming belonging to an idea of himself that has nothing to do with the man I married. And I do not know how to call him back from it without losing him entirely in the attempt. She tried in the ways she knew how. She cooked his favorite meals. She stayed up late to have the house warm and quiet when he came home. She asked him questions that required real answers. She planned a vacation to the Italian coast that he canceled, and then planned it again the following year, and he canceled again, and she did not cry about it where he could see. But she wrote about it. I planned the trip again. I chose the same hotel as before because I thought he might want to see it. He called from the car to say something had come up. I told him I understood. I do understand. That is the most painful part. I understand exactly why. And understanding it doesn't make it hurt less. During this period, she began meeting monthly with a Jesuit priest named Father Dominic Serrano. He ran a small parish called St. Anthony's 3 miles from their home, and he had spent 15 years as a social worker before entering the priesthood. He had a way of sitting quietly with difficult truths that Alina found steadying in a way she could not find anywhere else. She told Father Serrano things she could not tell anyone. She told him she was afraid for Vincent, not of him for him. She was afraid that the man she had seen in that restaurant kitchen, the lonely, quietly thoughtful man with his notebook, was disappearing beneath the weight of everything he had built. And she was afraid that by the time Vincent realized what he was losing, it would be too late to recover it. Father Serrano listened. He asked her once gently whether she had considered leaving. Her answer was recorded in the journal that same evening. I did not marry a mafia boss. I married a man who was capable of becoming one. Those are different things. And the man I actually married is still in there. I am not leaving him alone with all of that. In the spring of 2001, Alina Morty overheard something that changed everything, and she made a decision that she would carry in silence for the rest of her life. She had gone to the restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon to deliver documents to her cousin, who had managed the place for years. She arrived early and went around to the side entrance. In the alleyway behind the building, 2 men were talking in voices low enough to require concentration. One of them was Carlo Bassi. Carlo had been Vincent's most trusted lieutenant for 11 years. He had eaten at their table. He had held Caterina at her christening. He knew the address of their home and the schedule of their children. He was, in every visible way, family. Alina stood in that alleyway and listened. She heard enough, not everything, but enough. She heard Carlo say he had already handed over 3 months of financial records. She heard him say that Vincent would never suspect him. She heard a date, a meeting location, a promise that he needed more time before they could move forward. Alina stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she walked around to the front entrance and delivered the documents and drove home and sat in her kitchen for 2 full hours without moving. She wrote about it that night. I know what I should do. I know that telling him is the right thing, the obvious thing, but telling him what I heard is the same as handing him a gun pointed at Carlo. And I will not do that, not because I am naive about what Carlo is. He is a traitor and he is dangerous, but I cannot be the first link in that chain of consequences. I will not live inside that. So I am going to do the only thing I can think of that protects Vincent without putting blood on my hands. Over the following 3 months, Alina Morty began systematically guiding Vincent away from decisions that would have left him catastrophically exposed. She never said why. She invented reasons. She said she had a feeling. She said her stomach was uneasy about a particular evening. She said the timing felt wrong. She created domestic reasons, family obligations. Invented minor health concerns that altered his schedule, just enough to keep him away from the locations and situations that Carlo Bassi was carefully reporting to investigators. She protected him without his knowledge. She stood between him and destruction, using nothing but her quiet influence over the rhythms of his daily life, rhythms she understood better than anyone else on earth. Better even than Vincent understood them himself. Vincent, who had spent 30 years trusting his own instincts above all things, attributed the strange run of near misses during that period to luck, to his own judgment he never once suspected. Carlo Bassi was eventually exposed by someone else inside the organization. The situation resolved itself in the way those situations always did, brutally and finally, without Alina's direct involvement. She wrote only one sentence in the journal when it was over. "He is safe, it is enough." She never told anyone, not Father Serrano, not her sister, not Caterina, even years later when her daughter was old enough to understand. She closed that chapter of the journal and kept moving forward into the life ahead of her, carrying that secret the way she carried everything, quietly, without complaint. And with a love so complete it required no witness. Caterina Morti was 17 when she came home from school one autumn afternoon and found her mother sitting alone at the kitchen table, hands folded, eyes closed. She wasn't sleeping. She looked like someone trying very hard to stay strong. Caterina sat across from her and waited. After a moment, Alina opened her eyes. "Mom, what's wrong?" Alina looked at her daughter for a long time, then she said something Caterina would remember for the rest of her life. "Nothing is wrong. I'm just tired of carrying things that were never mine to carry." At 17, Caterina didn't fully understand, but she never forgot those words. What she didn't know was that earlier that day, Alina had gone alone to a doctor's appointment. She had heard the words she had feared for months: ovarian cancer, stage 2. Afterward, she sat in her car outside the house for nearly 20 minutes before finding the strength to go inside. That night, she wrote in her journal, "Today, doctor Farrell told me what I already suspected. Cancer. He says we've found it early enough to fight. I believe him. I choose to believe him. I am not afraid of dying as much as I am afraid of leaving. Dying happens to you. Leaving happens to the people you love. I need to tell Vincent," but she didn't tell him right away. She waited 3 weeks. Vincent was dealing with a matter that affected many lives, including their children's, and Alina refused to burden him until it was finished. So she carried the news alone. Then one quiet Sunday afternoon in November, she finally told him. The radio was off. Outside, the first frost had killed the tomato plants. Inside, Alina sat across from her husband and spoke the truth the way she always did, simply and directly. That night, she wrote about his reaction. "He didn't speak at first, he just looked at me. For a moment, he looked like a man who had no power at all, as if everything he had spent his life building suddenly meant nothing. Then he reached across the table and took my hands. He held them carefully like something precious he was afraid to lose. Finally he spoke. Tell me what you need, not we'll beat this, not I'll fix it, just tell me what you need." And in that moment I saw the man I married, the man beneath everything else. For 2 years Alina fought, she underwent surgery. She endured chemotherapy with the same quiet dignity she brought to every hardship. She lost her hair, joked about it with her children, cried about it alone, then came back to the kitchen and made dinner as if life still expected her to show up. She followed every instruction. She attended every appointment, and she filled her journal with observations that were sometimes heartbreaking and sometimes unexpectedly funny. To Alina's surprise, Vincent became a different man. He canceled meetings, he rearranged obligations that once seemed untouchable. He drove her to every appointment and waited outside because she insisted on facing treatment alone. Yet whenever she walked back through those hospital doors, he was always there, same parking space, same car, same hands resting on his knees, waiting. Father Serrano visited once a month just as he always had, only now he came to her. He brought no advice, no speeches, just his presence. Alina said it was exactly what she needed. One afternoon, Marco came home from New York and found the priest sitting quietly with his mother at the kitchen table. Neither was speaking. Alina saw her son standing in the doorway and reached out her hand. Marco took it and sat beside her. For a long time, the three of them said nothing at all. Those months changed the house. What had once felt large and distant became small, warm, and necessary. Caterina moved back home. Marco extended his stay. And many nights Vincent sat beside Alina's bed reading aloud from whatever book rested on her nightstand. Sometimes he stumbled over unfamiliar words, Without opening her eyes, Alina corrected him. He would smile, then start again. Nearly 9 months into treatment, Dr. Farrell called with a word nobody had dared expect: remission. That evening, Alina wrote in her journal, Dr. Farrell used a word I had been afraid to hope for: remission. Vincent was sitting alone in the backyard when I told him. He stood up and held me for a very long time without saying a word. Then he whispered something against my hair. I thought I was going to lose you. I asked him to say it again. I thought it was going to be my fault. I asked him how it could possibly be his fault. He said, because I spent 30 years building a life you deserve to escape from. I thought about that for a moment, then I told him the truth. I never wanted to escape, Vincent. I just wanted you to come back. He held me tighter after that, and for the first time in a very long time, I think he understood. There was a 2-year period after the remission when something quietly, genuinely changed between them. It was not dramatic. It did not involve a grand declaration. That was not who Vincent was, and Alina would not have trusted it if it had been. But slowly, in real and practical ways, he began letting things go. He stepped back from certain responsibilities and handed them to other people with a finality that those people understood without requiring explanation. He came home earlier. He sat at the dinner table until it was finished and then stayed longer. He began working in the garden. Alina had to guide him the first spring because he had never done it before. She showed him how to prepare the soil, how deep to set the roots, how to water without drowning. He was clumsy at it. She told him so without cruelty. He came back the next morning and tried again. By the second summer, the tomatoes were his. He grew them from seeds started on the kitchen windowsill in February, exactly the way she had always done. In August of that second summer, he placed the first bowl of tomatoes he had grown himself on the dinner table without saying a word about it. He simply set them there and sat down. But his expression betrayed everything. Alina looked at the bowl, then she looked at him. They're beautiful. They're not as good as yours yet. They're better, actually. He knew she was lying. He didn't argue. That evening she wrote, we had tomatoes from his garden tonight. He is terrible at growing them, and they are the most beautiful things I have ever seen on a table. I think this is what hope looks like when you have stopped expecting it. Those 2 years were the closest they ever came to the life Alina had imagined for them in the beginning. Not perfect. Never simple, but real and present and full of the small moments she had always believed were the actual substance of a life worth living. She kept writing. She recorded everything. She did not know yet that the cancer had not gone anywhere. That it had simply gone quiet, the way the worst things do, waiting patiently in the dark, while the people above it went about the business of beginning to heal. The cancer returned in the spring of 2018. It came back differently this time, more determined. Her body resisted treatment in ways it had not before. The exhaustion was not temporary but foundational, the kind that lives in a person's bones rather than their muscles. She lost weight. She needed help with things she had always managed alone. She accepted this help without the fierce resistance she might once have shown, and both her children privately agreed that their mother's quiet acceptance was the most frightening sign of all. Vincent did not leave her side. He was there in the mornings when she woke, there in the evenings when she tried to sleep. He had aged in the years since the first diagnosis, his hair fully gray. His face settled into deep lines, but the expression he wore during those final months was not the one that had made men afraid of him. It was the expression of a man trying to memorize something before it disappears. 3 weeks before the end, Alina had one unexpected day of clarity. A brief return of energy, the kind that sometimes arrives near the end without warning, feeling like recovery but meaning something else entirely. She got out of bed. She sat in the kitchen. She asked Katerina to bring her the cedar chest from the bedroom. Katerina brought it. Alina sent her out of the room. She sat alone at the kitchen table for 45 minutes with the cedar chest open before her. When Katerina came back, the chest was closed and her mother was looking quietly out at the garden where Vincent's new tomato seedlings were already beginning on the windowsill. "What were you doing?" Katerina asked. "Organizing a few things," Alina said. She did not say what. 4 days later, on a Thursday evening in late October, with Katerina in the kitchen and Marco in the front room and the nurse already gone home, Vincent sat in the chair beside Alina's bed and found her awake and looking at him with the deliberate expression she wore when she was choosing her words carefully. He said, "What are you thinking about?" She said, "That kitchen, your cousin's restaurant, the soup." He almost smiled. "You almost walked past me. I did almost walk past you. But you didn't. No, she said, I didn't. A silence settled between them that was not uncomfortable. She said, Vincent, yes, in the cedar chest, there's a journal, leather cover. Let Katerina find it first. Let her read it before you do. He looked at her steadily. Why her first? Because there are things in it that belong to her too, things a daughter should know about her mother. He nodded. He didn't speak for a moment. Then, what is in it? She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts love and something that resembled resolution, the face of a woman who has decided that the time for keeping things has finally passed. She said 30 years. Then she looked toward the window, toward the dark outside, toward the garden she could no longer see but knew was there. The tomatoes are going to be good this year, she said quietly. I can tell from the seedlings. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead very gently against her hand. He stayed that way for a long time without speaking. She said, I would choose you again. I want you to know that. I would walk back into that kitchen every single time. He said her name. Just her name. She closed her eyes. She did not wake again. 3 days after the funeral, Katerina found the journal. It was exactly where Alina had said it would be, leather-covered, worn at the corners, filled from the first page to within 20 pages of the last. Katerina sat on the edge of her parents' bed and began reading. She read for 4 hours without stopping. She read through the early years of the marriage and the distance that grew in the middle years and the loneliness her mother had carried without complaint. She read the pages from 1996 and 1997 and 1998, and she understood, for the first time, the full interior life of a woman she had thought she knew completely. And then she reached the spring of 2001. She read about the alleyway behind the restaurant, about Carlo Bassi and the overheard conversation. About her mother standing in that alleyway for 30 seconds and then walking calmly around to the front entrance to deliver documents as though nothing had happened. She read about the 3 months that followed. About the invented feelings and the rearranged schedules and the quiet, precise protection her mother had built around her father using nothing but her knowledge of his daily life. She read her mother's internal argument, the anguish, the moral weight, the decision not to become the first link in a chain of violence. She read the final sentence of that entry, he is safe. It is enough. Katerina sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after reading that sentence. Then she carried the journal into the living room and sat across from her father. She said, Dad, there's something you need to know about who Mom really was. She told him about the alleyway. She read him the entries from those 3 months, her voice breaking and repairing itself as she went. She read him the sentence about Carlo, the decision, the reasoning, the mercy in it. She read him her mother's description of why she had made the choice she made. And then she read him the final line, he is safe, it is enough. Vincent Morty sat completely still. He was still sitting in the same position when Katerina finished. She closed the journal carefully and held it in both hands and waited for him to speak. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was very quiet. He said, she never told me. No, for 17 years she never said a word. No, Dad. He looked at the journal in Katerina's hands. He said, she protected me and she never told me. She carried that alone for 17 years and she never once asked me to know about it. Katerina didn't answer because there was no answer required. Vincent stood up slowly and walked to the window and stood there looking out at the November yard, the dead garden, the bare soil, the tomato stakes still standing from the summer. He stood there for several minutes with his back to his daughter. When he turned around, his eyes were wet. Katerina had never seen her father's eyes wet before, not once, not even at the funeral. At the funeral he had wept openly, devastatingly, but she had not been close enough to see his face. Now she was close enough. She said, are you okay? He said, I thought I spent 30 years protecting her. I thought that was what I was doing, building something, keeping the walls up. He paused. She was the one keeping the walls up. She was the one protecting me, and I didn't even know. He crossed the room and took the journal from Katerina's hands. He held it the way you hold something you are afraid you might drop. Now you understand what the 400 people in that cemetery did not. Now you understand why Father Serrano, who had known Alina Morty's interior life for 20 years, who had sat with her through every difficult season, who had heard things in that rectory that he would carry to his own grave, chose the words he chose at her funeral. He spoke about courage, not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The courage of a woman who chooses to love someone difficult not because it is easy or because it will be recognized, but because she saw something real inside him and decided the real thing was worth protecting. He said Elena Morty was not a quiet woman because she had nothing to say. She was a quiet woman because she had learned, through long experience and tremendous love, which things needed to be said and which things simply needed to be done. He said, I believe she knew more than most of us ever suspected. I believe she carried more than she was ever given credit for, and I believe that her silence about certain things was not weakness. It was the deepest form of mercy I have witnessed in 30 years of ministry. Nobody in that cemetery understood exactly what Father Serrano meant, but Vincent Morty had read the journal by then. He had sat with it the night before the funeral, alone at the kitchen table, and he had read 30 years of his wife's interior life, the loneliness, the fear, the love, the sacrifice, and he had understood, for the first time, the true dimensions of what she had been. Not a wife in the background of his life, not a woman who had simply endured. A woman who had built a shelter around him with her bare hands from inside their marriage, while he was busy building things that mattered far less. A woman who had stood between him and catastrophe without ever asking for his knowledge of it, his gratitude for it, or his acknowledgement that it had happened at all. When the white casket began its final descent and Father Serrano said her name for the last time, and the rain came down gray and relentless against the November earth, Vincent Morty went to his knees. Not because he was performing grief for the 400 people watching him, not because he wanted anyone to see. He went to his knees because the weight of what he now knew was impossible to stand beneath. Because he was understanding something that most men spend their whole lives never understanding, that the greatest thing that had ever been given to him had been given quietly, without ceremony, without any requirement that he notice it. And he had not noticed, not for 17 years, not until she was gone. He pressed his hand flat against the cold earth above her grave. The rain fell on the back of his neck and soaked through his coat, and he did not move. Around him, 400 people held completely still. And the man who had made an entire city afraid of him wept in the November mud for the woman who had been, all along, the only thing in his life that was ever truly irreplaceable. There was one more thing in the cedar chest. Beneath the journal, beneath the folded documents and the photographs, Katerina had found a sealed envelope with her father's name written on it in Elena's handwriting. She had given it to him on the same afternoon she brought the journal, but he had not opened it immediately. He left it on his nightstand for 11 days. He looked at it every morning when he woke and every night before he slept. He was not ready. He knew that once he opened it, there would be nothing left to open. No further words from her waiting anywhere. This envelope was the last of her voice, and he could not yet afford to spend it. On the 12th day, a Sunday morning in December with snow falling outside, he made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten page. He read it slowly, then he read it again. The letter began by telling him that she had not written it to make him feel guilty. She had written it because she wanted him to know the truth about what their life had actually been, not the difficult parts. Not the distances and the disappointments, but the truth beneath all of that. She wrote that she had chosen him with full knowledge of who he was and what his life would require, and that she had never once regretted that choice. She wrote about the kitchen, the soup. The notebook, she wrote, I saw inside you before you could hide it. Everything I did in our life together, I did because what I saw that evening was worth protecting. You were worth protecting. Not the powerful man you became, the man underneath that, the one who wrote that quote in his notebook and couldn't decide if it was true. That man was worth every single thing it cost me. She wrote about the alleyway. She told him about Carlo Bassi in simple, direct words. She told him what she had heard and what she had decided and why. She told him she was sorry she had never told him while she was living, and then she told him she was not entirely sorry. Because she knew him well enough to know that knowledge of it would have changed him in ways she could not predict and did not want to risk. She wrote, I kept you safe, I did it gladly, I would do it again, and I want you to understand clearly, I am not telling you this now so that you will feel the weight of a debt. I am telling you because you deserve to know that someone loved you completely enough to stand between you and the worst thing coming, without needing you to ever know she was there. Then, near the bottom of the page in the last lines she wrote, the garden is yours now. Take care of it. Talk to the seedlings if you need to. I know it sounds ridiculous, and I know you will do it anyway and pretend you didn't. Grow the tomatoes, and Vincent, be the man with the notebook. Not the other one, he was never the real one anyway. With everything I have, always, Alina. He read the letter twice. He folded it with great care and held it in both hands for a long time. Then he put it in the inside pocket of his coat, close to his chest, and he left it there. He wore that coat every day for the rest of his life. And on the days when he wore a different coat, the letter went with him anyway, transferred from pocket to pocket the way you carry something you cannot afford to set down. In the months following Alina's death, Vincent Morty completed what he had begun years earlier with more conviction than he now knew he had possessed at the time. He finished withdrawing from the organization with a finality that left no ambiguity and required no further conversation. He signed what needed to be signed. He moved into a smaller house on the north side of the city, not far from where Alina had grown up. He planted a garden in the spring. He was clumsy at it, the way he had always been clumsy at it. He kept going. He attended St. Anthony's on the first Sunday of each month, the same day Alina had always gone, and he sat in the third pew from the front on the left side, near the window. The spot she had described in the journal. Gold in the morning, blue in the late afternoon. It changes depending on when you arrive, which I think is the point. He began arriving at different times just to see if she was right. She was. He donated to 3 organizations she had quietly supported for nearly 15 years, a family shelter, a pediatric oncology fund, a literacy program. He made the donations without his name attached to them, the way she had always done. Katerina told him one afternoon over lunch that Alina had been supporting those same places for years. He said, "I know." He didn't explain how he knew. He had read it in the journal in a small entry from 2004 that he had almost passed over. "Gave to the shelter again today. I didn't tell anyone." It doesn't require witnesses to be real. He kept going to the garden. Marco came home for a long weekend in the spring and found his father on his knees in the dirt, working compost into the soil with his bare hands. Marco stood at the back door and watched for a moment before his father noticed him. When Vincent looked up, there was dirt on his hands and on his coat sleeve, and he appeared, for just a moment, like a man who had no idea what he looked like and did not care. Marco said, "Mom would say you're doing that wrong." Vincent looked down at his hands. "She would be right. Want help?" Vincent looked at his son. Something passed across his face that Marco would later describe as the expression of a man remembering something he had almost forgotten how to do. He said, "Yeah. Come here." 3 summers after Alina's death, Vincent Morty grew the best tomatoes of his life. He knew before he tasted them. He could see it in the color, feel it in the weight when he lifted them from the vine. He picked them on a Saturday morning in late August, standing alone in the small garden behind his house, with the morning sun doing what August sun does, falling on everything equally. Making no distinctions, asking nothing. He carried a bowl of them inside. He sat at the kitchen table. He sliced one open the way Alina had always sliced them, carefully with a good knife, as though the thing deserved respect. He ate it slowly. It was very good. It might have been the best tomato he had ever tasted. He sat with that knowledge for a moment, aware of the empty chair across the table, aware of the morning light falling across the wood the way it always had. Indifferent to who was or wasn't in the room. He said her name out loud. Then he said quietly, to the chair and the light and the August morning and the woman who had stood between him and the worst version of himself for 30 years, without ever asking him to know about it, "They're not as good as yours." He sat a moment longer. He smiled because she would have told him he was wrong. Because Alina Morty, who had carried secrets that would have broken most people and had loved a difficult man with a completeness that required no audience, would have looked at that bowl of tomatoes and looked at him and said without hesitation that they were better. And she would have meant it. That was the thing about her. She always found the generosity in things, even in a bowl of tomatoes grown by a man who had learned everything far too slowly. Even in a life that had cost them both more than it should have. She had looked at all of it, the distance, the danger, the years of almost, and she had found, somewhere inside it, something worth protecting. She had found him worth protecting. And he had spent the rest of his life trying to become the man she had always insisted he already was. Here is what remains, not the power, not the name. None of that appears in any honest account of what Vincent Morty's life actually contained that was worth the price he paid to build it. What remains is a woman who saw inside a man before he could hide it, and chose to stay because she believed that the real thing she had found was worth every quiet sacrifice required to protect it. What remains is 30 years of private pages, a leather journal, one sealed letter carried close to the chest for the rest of a man's life. What remains is a bowl of tomatoes on a kitchen table and an empty chair, and a man old enough to understand that the most powerful thing in his entire life was never something he built. It was something given to him freely and continuously and in complete silence by someone who asked for very little and deserved absolutely everything. The strongest man in the world is not the one who makes others afraid. The strongest man in the world is the one who learns, even if it takes him 30 years, even if it costs him everything, what kind of love is actually worth being strong enough to deserve. Elena Morty knew this. She spent her whole life showing it to the man she chose, in the garden, in the kitchen. In an alleyway behind a restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon in 2001, where she stood for 30 seconds listening to a betrayal that could have destroyed her husband, and decided quietly, without witnesses, without any expectation of being known, that she would stand between him and it. He is safe, it is enough, it was always enough for her. He just needed 30 years and one small leather journal to understand that it should have been enough for him too. For every woman who loved quietly and completely, and for every man who is still in time to show her that he knows, thanks for watching.